Our next talk in our conference is by Professor Emeritus Marion Blute, who is Professor Emeritus Department of Sociology here in our University of Toronto. Marion will tell us about both qualitative and quantitative research on science and useful, especially in a possible Canadian Society of History, Philosophy of Science, and so on. Marion, please take it from there.
Thank you, Jakob. Well, Jakob has mentioned my title, so I'll just move on down. So this is a summary of my abstract. That most work in the history and philosophy of science focuses on singularities, this piece of work, that school of thought, that theory, and such conceptual analysis can be scientifically useful. Some social scientists do so as well, and most of my own work on evolution, influenced in part by people like David Hall, Werner Callebaut, Anatole Rappaport, on biological, sociocultural, and gene culture coevolution has been on that type, clarifying concepts, improving theories, and so on. But more often, social scientists focus on big or perhaps biggish data, and my work on the sociology of science, often with students, has been of that type. So I have this sort of bifurcated group of work. So I think, since both are useful, I recently suggested that the Canadian Society for the History and Philosophy of Science be renamed the Canadian Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Science. After all, there is the successful ISHPSSB, as insiders always called it, or International Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology as an example, which will be meeting here in Toronto, by the way, later on this summer, which is the first time in its history it's met in Toronto. They had an off-year meeting once in London, but this is the first time in Toronto. So I'm very much looking forward to that because I've been going to ISH meetings for decades. So the growth of science and the neglect of Tarde. In 1972, while I was a graduate student and before the Web of Science or its precursors were even available, I used data from the Science and Technology Division of the US Library of Congress on the number of scientific and technical serials published by nation to show that, contrary to much talk at the time about the exponential growth of science, that the dependence of scientific productivity on economic development is best described as a power function. That is, the rate of scientific growth is related linearly to the rate of economic growth. The rate of scientific growth is related linearly to the rate of economic growth. 50 years later, in 2022, I used the Web of Science and Google Scholar to show that Gabriel Tarde is neglected relative to other 19th century sociologists. So there's the data from the growth of science in 1972, and you'll see that in the left thing, the power function at the bottom label has the highest coefficient, 0.89 and 0.91, depending upon the index. And here is entries in some scholarly databases on 19th century sociologists. And you'll see that Gabriel Tarde is the smallest. And these are 4 people that are usually talked about as the most prominent sociologists of the 19th century. And you see the citations to Gabriel Tarde are smaller, both in the Web of Science and Web of Science all database and in Google Scholar than any of the others. So in between those two, I did various quantitative things on science studies, most of them with graduate students, even one with an undergraduate. In 2006, I showed that postmodernism in sociological theory had its day, that social constructionism had become unstable, and that globalization was still growing. In 2010, I showed that the sociology of science had not been eclipsed by other descriptors, such as the sociology of knowledge, the social studies of science, or social epistemology. That was then, not now. I think now things would be a little bit different with Scientometrics. But in 2013, I showed that Donald Campbell's phrase, evolutionary epistemology, had been more successful than others, such as generalized Darwin, universal Darwinism, or variation and selective retention, to apply to extensions of Darwinism into the cultural, sociocultural, and other realms. In 2017, I showed that 2/3 of the abstracts from a meeting held at the Royal Society in London on new trends in evolutionary biology, biological, philosophical, and social scientific perspectives, tilted towards a new and not an extended evolutionary synthesis. That is, the strongest rebels were having their way. Now, since those times when I was using the Web of Science and Google Scholar, there has been a huge explosion in databases on science. Just a few weeks ago, Nature did a brief opinion-y kind of article on these, just kind of mentioning their various opinions, the author's various opinions on various one, like scholars' data, illicit, cite, consensus, and there's probably more that I don't know about, so that's worth keeping in mind. But I assume a lot of the people on this conference know about them. Anyway, since both qualitative and quantitative approaches have been useful in the study of science, both in my own work as well as my observation of that of others, I made the suggestion, and the suggestion was, as I said, that the Canadian Society for the History and Philosophy of Science be renamed the Canadian Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Science, and that it function accordingly. So I would like to hear some discussion of what you think of that suggestion. And that's basically all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Marion. Very interesting. Stefan.
I guess I want to hear a little more about what you think hangs on a label. That's part of it, but then I'll also just say that you know, it seems appropriate, and you know, here we are as philosophers and historians using social scientific methods, essentially, right? And so do you, I mean, it seems appropriate. What do you think hangs on a label here? And as somebody who's done the social science stuff, do you think that we're reinventing wheels, you know?
That's a good question. I've been amazed at this conference at the huge leap that's been taken in what I see as the history of philosophy of science, into not just into data, but into big data, huge data. I mean, some of the people that we've heard talks from are functioning almost as computer scientists, several of them. So but it does tend to be kind of separate, doesn't it? I don't know how much I mean, why are you starting a new program called Scientometrics? If it's well integrated in the history and philosophy of science, you wouldn't need things like new terms, Scientometrics, would you? I don't know that much about it. I just picked up on the term during this conference, so.
Right, but you seem to be assigning, I don't like the labels, right? Like people ask me, are you a philosopher, things like that. And I just say, look, it is as it does. If the discipline will do, you know, I don't want to be an essentialist about, about some of these terms. And so, I mean, you didn't really tell me what you think hangs on a label.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what I think of why I think this. Okay. I have a long, like I said, decades of experience in ISH. And I know how useful it is when biologists talk to historians, talk to philosophers of science, and talk to social scientists about the same thing, that they listen to each other and talk to each other about biology in that case. And I, to me, putting the discipline that putting what you're studying first is the most important, and not the tribes of disciplines. You know, the historians, the philosophers, the social scientists. And so it's my experience with ISH that makes me think that the Canadian Society would function in a better way in terms of going at and understanding science if it included social science, which typically tends to mean, or historically has meant, including more quantitative stuff. Although these days, there's a lot of change in that respect, as Rachel and lots of others have shown us. Well, that's religion, but not science. But
Thank you very much once again, Marion. Another round of applause.
Well, thank you for all your work organizing things, Sakal.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, Marion.